Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Dining with Death is a thing of the past, and the channel has officially rebranded. Here on Dark Hearts, I will be covering true crime, cults, dark stories, mysteries, serial killers, conspiracies, and occasionally we will travel to dark places. I have decided to kick off Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee with one of my all-time favorite true crime stories, a true boogeyman story. I have been fascinated with this story for over 20 years. Yes, I am very, very old. And even all these years later, I still find this story fascinating. It's a sad story, it's a dark story, but most of all, it's an important story. It is also a story that, even after learning everything I can about it, I'm still unsure we got it 100% right. Has a very tragic figure spent decades behind bars because he was an easy scapegoat? Or is this man truly the boogeyman in every sense of the word? This is the terrible story of Andre Rand, the man behind the urban legend Cropsey. I'm your host, Stacey Lee. Let's begin. Our story begins in a literal hell on earth. This is Willowbrook State School on Staten Island. It opened in 1947 as a home for the mentally and physically disabled, but by 1965 had 2,000 more residents than it was designed to house. The conditions, you guys. I'm going to show you a few photos here so you can get an idea of how bad it was. And this was not the Dark Ages. This was 60 years ago. And the fact that this was allowed to happen that recently just infuriates me. The children lived in filth. They were covered in their own urine and feces. They were naked. They were cold. They were fed slop. And they were treated worse than an animal in a cage. In fact, if you treated animals like this, it would be a crime. There is a documentary on Willowbrook that I will link in the description of this video, and that film includes interviews with people who used to work at the school, stating that the directors never even stepped foot inside. One former employee speaks about a room of 40 toddlers who lived behind 3 locked steel doors and never saw the outside. The people who worked there did try to bring attention to the deplorable conditions from time to time, but got nowhere. Each time they tried to speak to someone in authority, their complaints went nowhere. Some of the employees even contacted a reporter named Jane Curtin, who did 2 stories on the school, but the accusations in her articles were so horrific, the public denounced the articles as sensationalized to sell papers. People simply could not wrap their head around the fact that a state school would be doing the things that were stated in the article. Bill Bronston and Michael Wilkins, 2 employees at the school, then went to the parents of the patients, the parents who rarely ever visited the school. Back then, if you had a child with a developmental disability or a mental disability, you were told to lock them away in an institution and go on with your life. That was the thinking back then, and it's hard for us to imagine that now. Some of the parents did get involved, and they staged a protest. Immediately following that protest, Michael Wilkins was fired, but it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. On the day Michael was fired, the directors forgot to ask for his key back. So Michael called a friend of his, an up-and-coming young reporter named Geraldo Rivera, and said, "Hey, I have the key to this school. You need to take a camera crew and go see for yourself." So Geraldo literally barged into the school with no permission at all, using the key Michael had given him that opened most of the doors. That's why in the footage, the nurses and attendants look surprised to see someone walking through the school with a large camera attached to a mounted floodlight. They didn't know anyone was coming because no one knew they were coming. It was true guerrilla journalism, and the footage is copyrighted, so I can only show you stills. But take my word for it, this is not something you want to watch if you have triggers about child abuse and neglect. If I'm going to be fully honest, I cry every time I watch this documentary or see images from it because it is like nothing I have ever seen before. Geraldo takes this news footage to the team he works for at the news station. Before the film can even be developed, New York State authorities are calling the news station, threatening to sue if the footage was released. The directors at the news station looked at the footage and said, "Sue us, we're releasing this." And that decision changed the world of mental institutions and care for those with a mental disability. Now, that is a story on its own, and if you're interested in a deeper dive on Willowbrook and other institutions of its kind, I will absolutely do that. Just comment and let me know. Geraldo's documentary brought massive change. The dark steel locked doors were forced open, and although it did take years, major change was set in motion. By 1987, Willowbrook was shut down, and although its residents were shipped off to smaller group homes, some only marginally better than Willowbrook, it stopped the abuse from happening there and forever changed the way these institutions are governed and controlled. Now, when Willowbrook was closed down, there were, of course, some shady things that happened. Some residents, those with families who were involved, were closely accounted for and sent to live at other facilities. But the residents without that family support, there aren't really good accounts of what happened to some of them. There are many people that believe some of those residents were simply turned out, loose on the streets of Staten Island, and became homeless. And then, by the 1980s, there were rumors of former residents living in the woods near Willowbrook. Residents that had been left to fend for themselves and had become forest-dwelling maniacs, as the urban legends told it. Kids on Staten Island grew up hearing stories about the crazed lunatics living in the trees and abandoned buildings near Willowbrook. There were initiations that required kids to spend a night in those woods. There were keggers and bonfires in the woods where inevitably someone would sit and tell the scary stories of the mentally ill and disturbed and dangerous former patients of the mental hospital wandering around nearby. The woods surrounding Willowbrook and its grounds became the backdrop for ghost stories and murder stories and for urban legends. But one urban legend rose from the rest to become the scariest story of them all, and that is the story of Cropsey. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the legend of Cropsey was passed down from generation to generation, and it went like this. Cropsey was a homicidal madman, an escaped mental patient with a hook for a hand, who hunted children and dragged them back to the tunnel system that lay under the abandoned ruins of the old tuberculosis sanitarium. If you've ever seen the 1981 slasher cult classic horror film, The Burning, great movie, very cheesy in the best way, that entire film was inspired by the legend of Cropsey. And that film is where the name Cropsey comes from. In The Burning, a man named George Cropsey goes insane after a prank leaves him disfigured, and he begins killing campers in the woods. There's also a great Halloween episode of The Simpsons where Willie the groundskeeper plays the role of the Cropsey-like character, kind of slash Freddy Krueger. So this is an urban legend that is decades long and fully ingrained in popular culture. So once The Burning came out, the film, the boogeyman in the woods had a name, and that name was Cropsey. Not long after Cropsey had a name, he had a face. A 9-year-old girl is in her front yard on Staten Island when a car pulls up. Inside the car is this man, Andre Rand. Andre worked at Willowbrook as a janitor from 1966 to 1968 using the name Frank Bruchette. He left the school or was fired, and by 1969 was often homeless or living in local motels. On May 25th, Andre lured the 9-year-old into his car, quickly shut the door behind her, and drove to an empty lot where he then attempted to assault her. Fortunately, a passing police officer saw what was happening and stopped Andre before that could happen. Andre was arrested and sent to prison for 16 months for attempted sexual assault. He was released in 1972, and then girls in the area started disappearing. The first to vanish was 5-year-old Alice Pereira, who disappeared on July 7, 1972. Alice was playing in the lobby of her high-rise apartment building. She was seen by several people, and then she vanished without a trace. Andre Rand was questioned almost immediately because of his history. The police investigated for months, but there was never enough evidence to convict Andre of anything. Little Alice was never seen again. Rumors began to circulate about Andre Rand, mostly among high school-aged kids. Why? Because those kids were spending time in the woods around Willowbrook, and they had seen Andre Rand there. Andre Rand was living here in this small structure he had built in the woods. So yes, my friends, we have a real-life child predator living in the woods outside an abandoned mental institution. You can quickly see how this became such a big urban legend in that area. Some of the kids began to call Andre Rand Cropsey, and it stuck. The adults in the area had also heard rumors that there were former patients and inmates living in the woods and even inside the abandoned mental institution. But the adults thought the kids were exaggerating the sightings, trying to scare themselves or other kids with the stories. Then on July 15th, 1981, 7-year-old Holly Ann Hughes went missing. I've heard reports that her mother sent her to a deli to buy a bar of soap, but then I've also heard stories that Holly was walking around in the neighborhood and Andre gave her money and told her to go buy a bar of soap because she was filthy. What we know for sure is that Holly was walking around in her Port Richmond neighborhood and she never came home. And can I just say, the 70s, man, when you send a 7-year-old to the store by themselves or let them wander around the neighborhood, I wouldn't let my 7-year-old niece go in the store by herself like the little bodega while I sat in the car outside, let alone walk to the store. My little granddaughter is 6.5, and she's getting to the age where she doesn't want to hold my hand everywhere we go, and I literally just want to grab onto her everywhere because I'm so paranoid. I can't imagine just letting kids wander around, but they did back then. So I'm not blaming Holly's parents. That's just how things were at the time. Holly's folks filed a missing persons report, and the news of her disappearance spread around the area very quickly. Witnesses came forward to report that they had seen Andre Rand in his very recognizable Volkswagen circling the block where Holly disappeared about the time she vanished. So for the third time, Andre Rand was hauled in by police and interviewed. Just like with Alice's disappearance, they strongly suspected him, but as the weeks went by, they were unable to put a case together and they had to let him go. Holly's parents were desperate to find her. We've talked about the invention of the milk carton kids here on the channel before, and this happened in that era. So Holly's face was all over milk cartons as the police, her family, and volunteers searched for her. Andre Rand went on about his life. Holly was never found to this day. No one knows what happened to her. In 1983, Andre Rand saw a group of kids standing out front of the local YMCA. There were 11 kids kind of hanging out there. Andre pulls up and talks them into getting into his van, and then he drove them clear from Staten Island to New Jersey for White Castle and bought them burgers. By the time they got back to Staten Island, the kids had been missing for 5 hours, and their parents were furious that some random guy would take their kids in his car without their permission or them knowing from Staten Island to New Jersey. Now, Andre did bring all the kids back to the YMCA, but at that point the police had already been notified and they were in strong agreement with the parents. This was not okay and was in fact a criminal act. Andre was arrested again, this time for unlawful imprisonment. He spent 10 months in jail for this stunt. These stories from the 70s and 80s, we see so much of this, don't we? Everyone in town knows there's a bad guy. Everyone whispers about him and jokes about him, but not much is ever done. And I know this because I was a kid in the 80s, too young in the 70s to know much about it. But I will verify that yes, in the 80s, there was always a guy or two in every town that drove a creepy car and lived by himself, and all the parents avoided him and told their kids to stay away from him. But people just kind of let him be. Now, people stick cameras in their faces and organize groups to go to their house. And you can say what you want about the social media era. I know it has its problems, but I will tell you one thing. I know for a fact that it has exposed a lot of nefarious actions and bad people that otherwise would have been ignored. Now, if there's a creeper hanging out at a park, a couple of moms go and stick a camera in his face and follow him to his car and take down his license plate. And that did not happen in the 70s, the 80s, or even the 90s. And I'm here for it. I'm here for any tactic that exposes bad guys, actually exposes bad guys, not performatively does, and helps victims, period. I'm here for it. Even if it's obnoxious, even if it's on social media, if it helps protect a kid or a person from being abducted, I'm fine with it. If you don't want to be accused of being a creeper, don't act creepy. So Andre goes to prison for 10 months, and he is released again. Weeks later, 10-year-old Tyhees Jackson disappeared while she was out running errands in her Staten Island neighborhood. She was reported missing. Police searched, neighbors and family searched. Tyhees was never seen again. No body, no clues, just vanished. She has now been missing for over 35 years, and no one knows what happened to this little girl. Now, all the while the kids are going missing on Staten Island in these specific neighborhoods, police were, off and on, looking into Andre Rand. What most of the public did not know is that the police had also kind of linked them, at least as a suspect, to the murders of 18-year-old Audrey Lynn Nuremberg, who went missing in 1977, 42-year-old Ethel Louise Atwell, who was an employee at Willowbrook State School. Ethel actually vanished in a parking lot in 1978 walking from Willowbrook to her car. And Henry Gafforio, who vanished in 1984. Henry went by Hank, he lived in Port Richmond, and he also had developmental disabilities. Because these three victims were older, all adults, at least legally, some do not believe that Andre Rand is tied to them, but others are not so sure. These disappearances hung like a dark cloud over the residents of Staten Island. Everyone was aware of what was happening, but there just didn't seem to be much that could be done about it. People were unnerved, and those that were concerned kept a really close eye on their kids. Now, again, this was the 1980s, where many parents did not keep a close watch on their kids, but there were those who were warned and who were told, you can't stay out longer, you can't be out after dark, things like that. The legend of Cropsey grew. Some adults would scold high school kids about calling Andre Rand Cropsey, saying he was just a weird guy, he had a lot of problems, and that he hadn't been convicted of anything. Others, they didn't want him around at all. They didn't want him in their businesses. They didn't want him anywhere near their kids. But remember, long before anyone knew the name Andre Rand, there was the legend of the boogeyman, who would take kids from the woods and drag them into the tunnels below the abandoned buildings. Those legends dated back to the 50s. This is a story that people had lived with for a very long time. But now, the story seemed to be coming true. Jennifer Schweiger goes on what is supposed to be a short walk in her Staten Island westerly neighborhood. Jennifer was 12 years old and she had Down syndrome. She often got restless and liked to go on walks when she did. And on the day she vanished, her mother was doing some housework. Jennifer was really having a hard time sitting still. She was bored with TV, and her mom said, "Why don't you go and take a walk?" Well, Jennifer did not return home when she was supposed to. Her parents alerted the police and a massive search was undertaken. Volunteers canvassed the area, hanging these missing posters, attaching them to every telephone pole and business window in the area. It was one of the hottest summers in recent years on Staten Island, and people were very concerned about Jennifer in the heat. Even her little classmates at the elementary school joined in the search. People formed into teams of searchers, and they were assigned different areas to look for the little girl with special needs. The days went by, and then someone came forward. They had seen Jennifer walking alongside a homeless man who was pushing his bicycle. The witness was shown a photo of Andre Rand, and they said, yes, that was him. Now, Andre was actually born Frank Rashawn, but had changed his name. I couldn't find a lot of details on when or why. Police knew this, as it had been discovered years earlier when he was first arrested. So Andre was hauled in again. This being the 1980s, there are reports that the police went pretty hard at him. It's always difficult in these old stories to know whether all the rules of interrogation were followed, but I think it's safe to say with someone like Andre Rand already convicted in the public's minds, they probably were not. Now, this time when the police picked Andre up, they verified that he had, in fact, been living in the woods outside Willowbrook for quite some time. Willowbrook was either on its very last days of being open or already closed at this point. It closed the same year Jennifer vanished. Andre had been living off of food from the garbages, and he was known to spend a lot of time just outside the grounds of the hospital. Now, even though Willowbrook had just closed or was maybe still open, there were outbuildings all around the property that had started to crumble. They'd been abandoned for decades. So you have to picture this. It's a very creepy atmosphere. There's a huge prison-like mental institution out in the woods, surrounded by homeless camps and crumbling outpost structures. It is truly the stuff of horror films and nightmares. I don't know that Stephen King could write a better scenario. The district attorney finally felt they had enough to charge Andre this time, and he was formally charged with the disappearance and murder of Jennifer Schweiger. There was no body, and the prosecutors knew this would be an uphill battle, but they had the eyewitness and they had Andre's long-standing history of criminal behavior. Now, the reason I said in the beginning I'm not so sure about the outcome of this, there's really no physical evidence at all. Do I think Andre probably did this? Yeah. But as far as physical evidence goes, none. That's on the legal side. Now, for the public, all they saw was this: a drooling madman in handcuffs being held up by two detectives dragging him towards a police car. A madman who had been living in the woods next to a mental hospital, and a madman who had worked as a janitor at that mental hospital. I saw an interview with a law professor that says he uses the story of Cropsey as a case study for his law students. He uses it to show his students how photographs like this one are very unfair to the suspect and can result in them being treated unfairly. Now again, do I think Andre Rand did at least some of these crimes? I do. But did he do all of them? At this point, it had been 25 days since Jennifer had last been seen, and there was little to no hope of finding her alive. Her parents were still hopeful that they could recover her body, which would give them some type of closure and also make the case against Andre much stronger. Fortunately, or tragically, however you choose to look at it, their wish came true. On August 12, 1987, a search team looking for Jennifer came across a spot in the earth where clay had been mixed in with darker topsoil. It looked like it had been freshly mixed. And some of the volunteers noticed that they'd already searched here in this same area before, and when they had, this spot had not looked like that. They began to dig and within a minute uncovered a small foot. They had found Jennifer Schweiger. 35 days after she vanished, her body had been discovered in a shallow grave here by a grove of trees. The police went into action, gathering 40 police officers, trained dogs, and digging equipment. They assembled teams right outside of Willowbrook State School to try and find more evidence that might help them convict Andre Rand for Jennifer's murder. They were, of course, also still looking for the other missing children and adults that police believed to be tied to Andre Rand. Volunteers reassembled and met at a church hall, expressing anger over the fact that Andre had been released over and over. People began tying yellow ribbons around telephone poles and trees that lined the streets in Westerly in remembrance of the other victims whose whereabouts were still unknown. Some people were sad, some were relieved, but mostly they were just very angry. The Schweigers released a statement that was read by a family friend, Betty Fleming, and it said, "The past 5 weeks have been extremely difficult ones for the family. They want to express their sincerest appreciation to everyone who has offered assistance, and especially to hundreds of volunteers who have been searching and praying for such a long time." Investigators slowly and carefully removed the body from the grave and took x-rays. They also took fingerprints and dental molds. There was no question the body belonged to Jennifer Schweiger. The body was severely decomposed, so it was difficult to determine a cause of death. It was far too late to check for external damages or internal soft tissue damage. Jennifer's clothes and small purse were missing. So you can imagine what this poor girl had been through. Police searched the area repeatedly for Jennifer's items. They even used dogs, but they never found anything. Jennifer was laid to rest in a funeral attended by hundreds. Her parents asked for privacy, and the entire area grieved for this poor child that was taken in such a horrific manner. The public then turned its attention to Andre Rand, the monster that in their eyes was responsible for this terrible act. They learned he was born in 1944 in Manhattan, and he grew up in Ithaca. His father died when Andre was only 14, and Andre's own mother had spent quite a bit of time in mental hospitals. Andre's sister would later come forward and say that even though their mother struggled with mental illness, they were not abused as children. While Andre was in custody, it is reported that he bragged to his cellmates about being like Ted Bundy. One cellmate reports that Andre once said, "You know, me and Ted Bundy are alike in many ways. We both drove Volkswagens. Bundy's thing was women. My thing was kids. Do you think the police could figure that out?" Ugh. Andre's attorney tried to brush these reports off as Andre boasting and making up stories to make himself seem tougher than he was in order to survive prison. In the fall of 1988, Andre Rand went on trial. He'd spent most of his time leading up to trial in psychiatric care, undergoing mental evaluations and being studied by prison doctors. He stood trial for the kidnapping and first-degree murder of Jennifer Schweiger. Experts testified, police officers testified, even employees at Willowbrook testified. This woman testified that she saw Andre very often hanging around the perimeter of the property at Willowbrook, and that it was common knowledge he lived in the woods outside the school. In the trial, it also came out that Andre was suspected of murdering a 44-year-old nurse who worked at Willowbrook in 1978. Her name was Shin Lee, and the circumstances around her disappearance are very similar to those of Ethel Atwell. Shin was last seen walking home from the infamous Building 11 at Willowbrook. She was headed from there to her house in Seaview. Shin was later found murdered by strangulation and buried in a shallow grave near a wooded area on the Willowbrook grounds, and this was just 2 months before Ethel disappeared. Another thing that came out at trial was that Holly Ann Hughes' mother, Holly Cedarholm, received a phone call after little Holly disappeared. The caller was a man who called himself Sal and claimed to have Holly Ann imprisoned. Holly Sr. went to meet the man at Penn Station as she was instructed to do, but the caller never showed up. Holly Sr. later said that she didn't really believe the caller had her daughter, but she was desperate. And this is where Andre comes out and says he is the one that gave Holly money to buy soap at the deli because she was dirty and needed a bath. There simply wasn't ever enough to charge Andre with anything to do with Holly's murder at the time. The jury deliberated, but it could not come to a decision on the murder charge, which I find confusing. They did convict Andre of kidnapping Jennifer Schweiger, so it seems odd that they were able to find him guilty of taking Jennifer, but not of killing her. But I wasn't at the trial. Maybe the burden of proof was simply not met. Andre was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, which made him eligible for parole in 2008. Well, those chances went up in smoke when in 2004, prosecutors charged Andre for the kidnapping of Holly Ann Hughes 23 years earlier. Andre was convicted of kidnapping Holly in October of 2004, and he was given another 25 years to life. He will now be eligible for parole in 2037 when he will be 93 years old. Let's hope he doesn't make it that long. This remains one of the creepiest true crime stories I have ever come across. I'm sure it has something to do with being a child of the 80s, just after the era of the serial killer, when boogeyman stories were told around campfires and slasher films were all the rage. But I think it's more than that. This is a story about the way we treat the helpless and the mentally ill, and it's a story about how good people are all too willing to look the other way when they see the vulnerable being mistreated. The murders and the disappearances are horrible. We all agree on that. I hope we all also agree that it is high time we start providing better services and better treatment for those of us who struggle with mental diseases, and it's time to recognize that the patients inside the institutions are not always the monsters. Sometimes the true monsters are the ones who hold the keys. Thank you for joining me today on this very first episode of Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Hit the like button if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon. We have a big goal there, and it is this. We are going to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that has never been tested because there's no money to test it. There are thousands of sexual assault kits sitting in storage and refrigeration that have never been tested. They cost between $500 and $750 each to test. We would like to, as a community, pick a case, raise the money to get that kit tested, donate the money, and hopefully solve the crime. The other thing that happens is we get that perpetrator's DNA in the system forever, and if they've committed other crimes, other departments might get hits as well. We're gonna hit this really hard starting next week. If everyone donates only $1, we can get there. I'm excited about the rebrand of the channel, and I'm gonna bring you guys some really great stories. Please know you are always free to leave me comments and suggestions, letting me know what you would like to see. I sure appreciate your support. I know you have so many options of things to watch, so the fact that you choose to watch my episodes means the world to me. Stay safe, my friends. Happy New Year. Be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Bye.